Good afternoon, everyone. Everyone is starting to join us, so we'll give a minute or two as we welcome you all to today's Amberjack webinar with the ISE on the topic of fairness in assessment and selection. Delighted to be joined by Martin Kavanagh from Amberjack today, who's going to be taking us through this topic. The Q&A function will be enabled, so if you do have any questions for Martin, we're going to make sure there's time at the end to cover those questions. And the chat as well is available to you if you want to make any comments or add anything as we go along. So I'm now going to hand to Martin to take us forward into this session. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you very much, Georgia. Good afternoon, everyone. It's lovely to meet you all. My name is Martin. I am the head of assessment at Amberjack. I've got about 30 minutes of content to take you through. So you're not listening to me non-stop for 30 minutes. At about halfway through, there will be a point where I'll pause for an initial discussion point, because there's a part of the session that I think is going to lead to a lot of discussion and conversation. So I will pause there. But as Georgia says, you're encouraged to ask questions throughout the session, and the slides will be made available to you. So just to kick off with this admittedly slightly self-indulgent slide, which is acting partly as a soft launch of my brand new corporate photo, but I think it's also very helpful to give you a bit of background as to where I've come from, so you understand the angle I'm coming from in this session. So initially, I was seen as early career talent myself. I started after completing my master's in occupational psychology on the BT graduate scheme. Since then, I've done a range of roles, always focusing on talent assessment and development in both the public and private sector. More and more as I've progressed through my career, I've focused on really high volume processes. The other thing that's worth noticing is I've worked in organizations who do the whole end-to-end recruitment process, but I've also worked in organizations that take on a very specific part of the process. So all of that helps the lens that I am coming at talent assessment and selection with. And for the last 2.5 years, I have been working as the head of assessment at Amberjack. So for those of you who don't know a huge amount about Amberjack, I've got a bit of a summary slide here. The key points to pick out is that we are a genuinely end-to-end provider. And compared to working with providers where we've been responsible for a very specific part of the assessment process, being full end-to-end comes with its own absolute joys, but also its own challenges. So often, if you're responsible for one part of the process, you can say, well, maybe this process isn't working because something isn't happening upstream or downstream. So you can almost pass the buck and say, it must be something else. It can't possibly be due down to the part of the process that I'm responsible for. When you're responsible for the end-to-end, you don't get away with that. So you will see in this webinar, we are looking really forensically at every stage of the assessment and selection journey. We are absolute early talent specialists. So obviously, and given that it's a webinar in collaboration with the ISE, you'd probably expect it. We're absolutely coming at this topic from an early talent lens, but also therefore from a high volume lens. So you may well, if you're responsible for more niche recruitment, more niche requirements, or lower volume campaigns, perhaps, there will still be lots of insights for you, but we are unapologetically coming at it from a point of view of looking at campaigns that deal with high volumes of candidates getting through a funnel. So what am I hoping to do today? This is going to sort of keep me on my toes and make sure I deliver against these objectives. So first of all, there have been a number of really hot topics in fairness in selection and assessment, which have rightfully been debated at length in the last year. There is a potential risk that means we've lost sight of some of the smaller stuff that is impacting candidates' perceptions of fairness in an assessment and selection process. So I want to take us beyond the hot topics and look at all of the aspects of fairness in high volume processes. I always think it's important in these sessions to reassure you. There'll be stuff that you're doing that is really aligned with the evidence base that's out there, and there'll be things that you're doing, and it will make you think, you know, I'm really proud of the process we've built. We're doing a lot of things really well, but it should also encourage some continuous improvement. It absolutely encouraged continuous improvement in my practices and how we deliver assessments as an assessment team. And hopefully it will encourage you to critically evaluate your process practices as we get into depths that you might not have previously considered. And hopefully it will therefore empower you and encourage you to take some action. So there might be some things you've been thinking about doing for a little while, and this webinar will give you the evidence base to go ahead and do that. So why have I selected the topic to talk about? Why did I think it was so relevant? Well, first of all, I came across a really thorough really thorough review of all the empirical research that was done by the CIPD. So they did a meta-analysis, in effect, a rapid evidence assessment, appraising all of the high quality evidence from peer-reviewed journals. So if someone does all the hard work for you and puts it into a really digestible piece of research, it's worth paying attention to and taking from it what you can learn. So what I'm going to do is share the things that were most prominent and important to me. You will have your own takeaways if you read the full research. So I do encourage everyone to take some time and have a look through it. But what I'm trying to do is do some of the hard work for you. So if you're interested in the same sorts of themes around, you know, how do we make a very high volume process as fair as possible for early careers, hopefully I'm calling out the key things that you would too from the research. The other thing that made this CIPD research really interesting to me is it really resonated with a piece of research I did a couple of years ago, where I took thousands and thousands of verbatim feedback comments from early career talent going through high volume process, and I analyzed it into what matters in candidates. And I found all of the comments grouped into three really logical areas. So when candidates feedback on a process, they're asking the question, was it fair? Did they have the opportunity to demonstrate the skills, the behaviors that they could bring to the role, what they could bring to the organization? The second thing that was coming up in this feedback is it relevant? Was it obvious why I was being asked to complete the exercises I was being asked to do? Was it clear why the decision was made? And was that decision made based on criteria that is relevant to how likely I am to perform well in the role I was looking to do? And then the final point is, did it have a good outcome? Now, the most obvious interpretation of this is, did the person end up with a role? That obviously has some impact on how fair a candidate perceives the process. But in general, candidates are fair. They are typically aware they're going through a high volume process. So they know certain decisions are going to have to be made at certain stages. So actually what came out in the feedback as being most important in terms of having a good outcome is, did they feel they got something back in return for the time they invested in the process? So was the feedback they received meaningful, helpful, and high quality? So looking at how this sort of the sessions in this webinar is going to be broken down, is there were three clear pressure points in ensuring fairness, which I'll break down as we go through. The first one was this right up front. How do you design the correct assessment methods? The second one is then, how do you communicate those to the participants? And then the third one is, how do you make decisions and provide feedback to the participants? But what I found really interesting, and this is the topic where I will pause and open up some discussion after I give a little bit more background into it, is that underpinning all of the research was this underlying point throughout the research, where if you inadvertently trigger stereotype threat, you can have a big impact on the fairness in a process. So I just want to talk about that concept before getting into the three pressure points. So let me talk a little bit more about stereotype threat and how to avoid it. So I have a 10-year-old daughter, and something that I admittedly fell foul of myself, but is becoming a really encouraging trend, is if people use the phrase bossy when referring to a young girl, it typically gets called out. And that became quite a big topic. And the reason why it's getting called out more and more is the view that if it was a boy showing behaviors that is called bossy in a girl, it would be encouraged and they would be told, okay, you're showing leadership, you're showing that you're dominating that situation. That's a good thing, whereas it has a negative connotations with girls, so difference in behavior. The reason why that is relevant is because of this really interesting research that came in from Jackson and Clay in 2016. What they did is they looked at the impact of being transparent about the behaviors that are being assessed in a assessment process. So let's say, for example, you are assessing, the example up here is planning skills. So you might say to a candidate up front to be transparent because you think you're helping them. We are about to assess your planning skills. We are going to look into how you plan, how you multitask as you go through the exercise. What they did is they just gave people the exercise without telling them they were assessing planning skills, or they were completely transparent in the way I've just explained. Regardless of whether they were transparent about what they were assessing, there was no difference in performance in the male and female candidates. But something different happened when it was around how you assess assertiveness and leadership. So if there was no transparency, so you just went straight into the exercise, there was no difference between the performance in the male and female candidates. If they were transparent and they said, we are now going to assess assertiveness and leadership, that had a disproportionate disadvantage on the female candidates. And the hypothesis that was put in place is that they triggered a stereotype threat and made the female candidates think there is a way I am going to be expected to behave here in this exercise because they're assessing assertiveness and leadership, and then they behaved in a certain way. So that impacted the overall scores that were coming up. So really interesting point about how transparent are you and how do you communicate what you're assessing to candidates. And we've got some experiences ourselves. So again, we took action based on this research, and we found that in one of the assessment centers we designed, we had a session at the end of the day that was looking back. So it's one of those things that assesses your sort of growth mindset, your adaptability. So we would say, well, how did you perform during the day? Which exercises did you find particularly strong and which did you find particularly problematic? And we called it a reflective session. Now, we found research that in the same way as triggering the stereotype threat, as described with the female candidates was coming up in the Jackson Clay research, if you say reflective session, that is going to disadvantage candidates from certain ethnic minority demographics. So we changed the language throughout the exercise. We called the exercise a debrief session, and the wording was changed so it was moving away from this topic of reflective. And that change resulted in the biggest shift that I have personally seen in terms of reducing the impact of an adverse impact in an assessment center exercise. So this concept of stereotype threat and understanding some of those things that are likely to trigger stereotype threat could have a really big impact in fairness in your processes. And it's something that we're becoming really conscious of in how we design and deliver our assessments. So it is quite a big topic. The thing that when I've been talking to people about this article and sort of socializing my ideas from it, this is the one that's led to the most conversation. So I would be interested to just pause there, hear anyone's reflections or questions from this, or maybe people have got some examples of thinking, or maybe the way we're doing it is triggering stereotype threat, or perhaps you're looking for some advice on how to avoid it. So I would just pause there to see if it is triggering any interest and any want for further discussion. Georgia. I was wondering if any questions had come up on it in the session.
Yes, we've just got one in the chat from Dean. Thank you, Dean. Says, can you give more of a definition of stereotype threat?
Yeah, so it is this point where the reason why the point about assertiveness and leadership is seen as a stereotype threat is there is the stereotype that assertiveness and leadership is more of a male trait than a female trait. And it is a stereotype. So when I was working at Savile Assessment, I would use the Savile Assessment Wave tool to assess the behavioral traits of thousands and thousands of individuals. And there was no significant difference in the areas of providing leadership between male and female candidates. So it is a stereotype that males are more assertive and more leadership oriented. It can come up that males are, as I say, more assertive and more dominant in certain situations. So if you are transparent in the exercise design and say we're now going to be assessing assertiveness and leadership, the Jackson-Clay hypothesis is that a female candidate is going to overthink that because they're aware of the stereotype, they're aware that they might not be as ready to be assertive and as a male candidate. So they start to act in a different way. And that is the reason why they were seen as this lower score in the female candidates.
Thank you, Martin. This has definitely kick-started some conversations. So Emily has another question for you. How was the term reflection a disadvantage to particular groups? Was this in regard to a practice of self-reflection or something else?
Yes, absolutely. So I said that. So the language throughout is we want you to self-reflect. We want you to think about, the things you could have done better, the things you could have done differently, really reflect on your performance. It was all that language constantly. And then there was some, and I can absolutely share I should have put the reference on the slide, but I'm happy to share the reference for this after the session. But there was some really interesting research that in certain cultures and in certain demographics, that will again trigger that sort of stereotype threat. They will be not expecting to be as strong as that. So they will be starting to behave in a way that doesn't feel authentic, how they think they need to reflect, how they think they need to do that. So when it became a debrief session, which was more just, very factual, let's talk about the day, let's talk about how the exercise went, even that really, really subtle shift in language without changing much about the content of the exercise, just as I mentioned earlier, really did get rid of that sort of impact of the adverse impact that we were seeing.
Thank you, Martin. Caroline echoing what I think a lot of people will be thinking, which is it's really interesting to see the impact that nuancing of language has. So thank you for sharing that. We have another question just come in. The chat is starting to go, so I've just got to grab that back from Charmin. Apologies if I haven't said that name correctly. The question is, do you recommend being transparent about the skills that you're going to be assessing throughout the recruitment process? So everything from maybe a video interview through to assessment days. And do you have any thoughts on being transparent about competencies being assessed too? Reflection here is that they've seen some companies sharing this information on their early careers websites, so being very transparent at the very beginning of the process.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I'll pause the point about what to communicate. So I cover that. There's some more interesting stuff in the research, so I will pick that up in a moment. How transparent are you with the competencies you're assessing is a really interesting point, and particularly in relation to the discussion around should interview questions be shared in advance and various points like that. I've seen interviews designed, for example, interviews are a good example, where every competency is introduced in turn, and then you say, these are the behaviors we're interested in this area. I would avoid doing that based on this research and what I've seen in practice, because there's so much going on in an interview. You're going to be particularly triggering any sort of unconscious, if there are unconscious stereotype threats, or you're going to be creating a cognitive priming situation. they might have had an example they were going to use, but they're thinking back to your introduction and thinking that might not be right. It will lead candidates to overthink it. So I would just ask the question that you're looking to ask rather than necessarily saying, here are all the behaviors we're looking to do. But I would be more transparent up front to let candidates know what is being assessed through the process. And that relates to both the relevance point and the fairness point from that sort of circle I was showing earlier. And I'll come on to what the research is saying about how you do that as we go through the session.
Thanks, Martin. You may be coming on to cover this as
Mm.
well, but just so you're aware, there's another question here from Joanne, who's saying, when inviting candidates to the assessment process, should we be fully transparent of what will be assessed to allow for preparation? So I think there's a nuance in Joanne's question about, where's the line between being helpful for preparation and actually triggering some of these biases or thoughts that may lead the candidate into a negative situation.
Yeah, sure. And I will come on to that. And just on that point about how to get the balance right, one of the key things I say, and I've talked about this in sessions before, is sometimes you don't spot things and then they come up by looking at the data. So the example I gave where we changed the language from reflective session to debrief session, that came up because we were seeing in the data that we were seeing a big drop off in certain types of candidates, and we looked into it in specific detail. So it's worth trying things out, and I'll come on to what we say in preparation calls, for example, in assessment centers, but you definitely need to tell people how you're going to assess them and what sort of assessment methods are being used. And then you just make sure that if you're then doing that and then there is something showing in the data that looks a bit unusual, then it is worth looking back and saying, okay, well, what is happening there? What could be happening in that specific exercise that's resulting in that? What are we telling them that's impacting that? I might just stop with the questions there,
We're good
Georgia.
we're good
Carry
to move
on.
on. Actually, that covers
Okay,
everyone so far,
perfect.
Martin.
Good
Thank
timing.
you.
Excellent. Thank you, Georgia. Okay, and as I said, there will still be plenty of time if people want to carry on the conversation for further questions at the end. But let me go through the other points I was specifically mentioning at the start. So first of all, the designing and selecting the correct assessment methods. Now, a really key point that came up is that perceived job relevance to the assessment process that we've talked about a couple of times in the session, that what the research is showing is that can actually have more of an impact on fairness perceptions and overall outcome. So often, and I see many people do this, feedback is perhaps sort of dismissed if it's coming from an unsuccessful candidate because you think, oh, they've just got a sort of an axe to grind in the process. They want to have a bit of a moan because they didn't get the role. Actually, what this research is saying is that more than the overall outcome, what can cause candidates the most issues with a process is the perceived job relevance. So making sure that it's clear the link between what you're assessing and how you're assessing it is made is particularly key for perceptions of fairness. And this is something I've talked about a lot. And I talk about this topic in terms of just the validity of a process. So a trend I really see is organizations backloading the investment of their assessment. So they create a very, very high specification assessment center that is all singing, all dancing, and gives a really, really good candidate impression, very, very immersive and engaging. But actually, the early stages of the process are less engaging, and they've put a disproportionately lower amount of their budget into it. Now, my thought on that is always, it doesn't matter how good your assessment center is, if you're not moving the right people through the funnel, that isn't a sensible investment in time. But actually, there is research here on the screen that the first stage in the process also holds the most weight for candidates in terms of their perceptions of fairness. So what typically happens, and I've seen it in a lot of processes, is a very, very, sort of high utility, maybe a off-the-shelf cognitive ability test or an off-the-shelf situational judgment test that is used upfront to get the candidates down to a manageable number. If the candidate can't see the link between what they're being asked to do and what they're doing, that can have a big impact in their perceptions of fairness of the organisation and their likelihood to stay in the process. So it came up a couple of times in the questions. I said I'll come on to it. There's a lot in there about communicating the process to candidates, and this would go without saying that providing a clear explanation of the stages is vital for fairness. So in terms of what we absolutely advocate in order of most importance, and this links into the points earlier, the first thing we absolutely insist on doing from an Amberjack perspective is, if there's an online testing assessment being used, provide practice tests. This allows candidates to make sure it works with their accessibility software, that any adjustments that they have are factored into it. It's harder to do at the assessment centre. So what we typically do by default is provide to our clients assessment centre preparation calls, either on a group basis or in an individual basis, sometimes a targeted individual basis, perhaps for specific positive action reasons, where we take candidates through exactly what to expect in the assessment centre, so they again can think, is this going to work with the accessibility requirements I have? So in those assessment centre preparation calls, if there is an assessment framework that is being assessed against, we will make sure that the candidate knows what that assessment framework is, and where they can access it on the client's often website. Again, thinking back to that, was it fair? If they feel that they weren't told to any degree what was being assessed against, that could become a problem for perceptions of fairness. So we do tell them that. I would stop short of going into too much detail of all the aspects of exactly which behaviours underpin each competency, and going into too much detail, particularly as mentioned earlier, where this could potentially trigger some of those stereotype threats. So a really important thing to do in your communication is explain why the assessment is relevant. So often assessments are put in place that are really well considered. So a validation study has gone in to understand how that predicts the performance in the role, a really good understanding of which behaviours are needed, huge amounts of job analysis, for example. Tell the candidates that will improve the perceptions of fairness. Tell them that this assessment shows and is really accurate at predicting those who are going to perform in the role. We'd also encourage people to be told how long it will take, and also how and when the outcome of the process will be communicated, if it is known up front. And really important, partly because it's a GDPR requirement, if you are auto-scoring using artificial intelligence on video interviews, for example, is telling candidates how performance is scored and how decisions are made. And I'll come on to a couple of other points around fairness in relation to that later on. So again, we have checklists for making sure that we are covering off an explanation of what is included in our communications, which is good practice to do, and thinking really in real detail about how you explain to candidates. And also there's a feedback loop here. If you get lots of questions coming in from candidates about a specific thing, or if you get certain themes in your feedback that you need to address, you can change your communications in future years. So we've already covered deeply considering the words used in candidate touch points in relation to stereotype threat, but this is also relevant in terms of avoiding assessment processes becoming by proxy verbal reasoning assessments. So are you in assessment content using content that is as plain English as possible? Are you making sure that there's no jargon, that there's no specific language that might work if English is your first language, but not for other people? So both the assessment materials and the candidate touch points, this is relevant for. That's one of the things that we absolutely review in our processes. In terms of what came up in the article around making decisions and providing feedback, the first point was around being really considerate in the wording of feedback. And again, this is something we probably all like to think we do, but there's some really sort of proactive steps that can be taken. So one of the ways of sort of keeping positive in a feedback writing, often people want to make sure that they're writing feedback in a way so there can be no comeback from the candidate, as a lower risk of any sort of legal implications of the candidate coming back to the feedback. And that can influence how feedback is communicated. And I do see too often people saying, for example, you were rejected for these reasons, rather than explaining that actually they did well to get to that stage. Only the top performing candidates progressed. Here's what you could have done to be considered one of those top performing candidates. So moving it to that more positive phrasing is seen as a really good step in providing feedback. It's also really important to avoid making sweeping statements that can really impact a candidate's perceptions of fairness. So saying, you know, it is clear that you are the sort of person who isn't able to work in a team based on what you saw in a 30 to 45-minute exercise, can create those issues of perceptions of fairness. So it's all right to be clear that you have based your decisions on what you saw in the assessment, and that the feedback is based on those areas. So justify why you're providing the feedback, justify why you've made the decision, explaining why the exercises were chosen. And again, you've already explained that that exercise is relevant, so you're building up that communication picture with your candidates. And one of the key things is avoid excuses. So a classic thing that gets very problematic feedback is saying, you know, you're absolutely outstanding. There's nothing more you could be doing. There was just unfortunately someone who was just that little bit better than you, but there's nothing else you can do differently. The candidate will always say, well, there must be something I could have done a bit differently because there is someone who performed better than me on the day. There's something about the timing of the decision which I found really interesting. So this research by Condat et al. Found that giving the decision as soon as possible increases perceptions of fairness. So the longer you wait, the more the perception of fairness decreases, except if it's the same day. And if it's provided on the same day, there is a drop-off in terms of the perception of fairness. So it might feel like you're showing your efficiency if you're assessing process, but actually if you call a candidate on the same day as they've completed their assessment center, for example, the research is saying that that has a big knock-on effect and a negative implication in terms of the fairness area. Okay, I started off by saying there are some hot topics that are sort of dominating the thinking, but it would be impossible to talk about candidate fairness without discussing the impact of AI and technology. And a first bit of research which comes up from a couple of different sources is that actually the research is showing that human screeners are rated as fairer. So if you are getting candidates to complete a video interview, if you have humans scoring that as opposed to artificial intelligence scoring that, candidates perceive, sorry, bear with me, I've just realized I haven't plugged in my laptop and I'm worried it's about to power off. Bear with me. Excuse me. Okay, yes. So if you are using human screeners, candidates perceive those to be fairer in the process. So again, if you are using manual review screeners, tell the candidates that. They will want to hear that. So I think more and more they are assuming they aren't going to be scored by a manual screener. And talk about how, thinking back to that fairness and relevance, you can talk in your communications about how those people are trained and how they make sure that they're scoring in a fair way against the criteria that's necessary for the role. A topic that comes up a huge amount with clients is, should we be assessing in face-to-face or virtual settings? Well, the key thing is, and I know there are some organizations that do sometimes do this, the key thing is don't assess using a combination of both for the same role. Because what the research showed is, if nothing else changes, it's just the same exercise in either a virtual or face-to-face setting, those in a virtual setting are scored more harshly than those in a face-to-face setting. So let's say, for example, you might think it's a a nice thing to do for social mobility, to say you can either come, if you're not able to cover expenses, you might say, well, you could either complete in the luxury of your own home, or you can come into our office in a face-to-face setting. If you are doing that and scoring them against the same criteria, you'll be giving an advantage to those attending in a face-to-face setting. And linking back to this point around scoring of video interviews, for example, this is something, because we do assess quite extensively using video interviews, and there's been a lot of talk about the validity, the impact of validity of people using ChatGPT and other generative AI sources. So this research was outside of the CIPD research, but the first academic research that I've seen in a really scientific way did show that if you've got what we call an asynchronous video interviews, where candidates presented with a question and they have to provide a response, candidates who were using either verbatim ChatGPT answers or paraphrased answers were scoring higher than candidates who weren't using ChatGPT. So the content in those ChatGPT responses was good and was achieving higher scores. But what it also showed is that those candidates were all getting lower scores in the honesty and integrity criteria that was being assessed. So you can, to a degree of certainty, spot when individuals are using ChatGPT. And this becomes really important because in the research, the individuals who were cheating using ChatGPT, and they were told to use it, so it wasn't personal choice to use it, they were told to use it as part of the study, they were commenting on how unfair the process was. So the fact they knew that they could use it to game the process was resulting in a challenge to the perception of fairness. So again, this is being managed through, for any assessments where we are using these asynchronous video interviews, through managing candidate communications and explaining to them what the expectations are around the use of generative AI, whether it can be used or it can't be used, and then explaining what's going to happen in the process, how people are trained to make sure that these sorts of tools aren't being used in the responses. And that is managing the perceptions of fairness. And it brings up the most important point around, if you are scoring individuals, perhaps using manual scorers, the importance of a quality assurance process. So we have a quality assurance team. So any manual screening we're doing, or if any of our clients are using automated AI scoring in their process, we encourage using our resource to quality assure the quality of the AI in effect. So run a really good quality assurance process to make sure that all assessors are using the same frame of reference. If assessor A scored this candidate and assessor B scored the candidate, you have a certain degree of certainty that they would score in the same way. So I've put on the screen, and you'll be able to access in the slides after, the quality assurance process that we follow. If there is any manual intervention, I'd encourage putting that into your process. And if you tell candidates that you're doing that, it will enhance their perceptions of fairness in the process. So I'm just going to pause before we go back on to into the questions and answers, and just reflect a little bit on what we said we were going to do right at the start of the session. Hopefully we've achieved these objectives. So we wanted to look beyond some of the hot topics and reflect on all aspects of fairness in a high volume process. There is a lot to unpick in that research. I have picked and have briefly explained the bits that are most interesting to me and have had the most impact on the practice that we follow in Amberjack in our assessment team. I'm sure there'll be other stuff that comes up to you. Hopefully it's reassured you in some areas that you're doing really well. There might be other areas where we've encouraged you to critically evaluate your practices, and hopefully that's provided an evidence base for potential improvements to make in your processes. And another piece of research that Amberjack do on an annual basis to encourage continuous improvement and empower you and encourage you to take action is our annual insights survey. And my colleague Emily is on the call, who is the Amberjack head of global marketing. I'll hand over to Emily to give you a little bit more information about that so you can gain all the insights from that research as well.
Thanks, Martin, and good afternoon, everybody. Bit of a shameless plug from me, but just wanted to highlight that our annual insights reports are due for release at the end of this month. I'm sure some of you are familiar with them, but for those who are not, our insights reports analyse all of our candidate data that go through our technology platform. So we look at themes and trends in candidate experience from around 400,000 candidate applications. We also send out an employer survey asking our clients and obviously those that we're engaged with some of the themes and trends and challenges that they've experienced as well. So those reports will be coming out at the end of October. Just to give you a little bit of insight in some of the data that we've seen so far, and some of this will be no surprise, but some of this is starting to look very interesting. 40% of employers have reported their biggest challenge in their assessment process is maintaining that diversity throughout the pipeline. 38% have made changes in response to the advances in Gen IA, which obviously Martin spoke to a moment ago. Interestingly, 50% are still using CVs in their process, which I know that's quite a big topic that lots of employers debate regularly. And 61% have actually moved back to a fully in-person final stage of their process. So that assessment centre piece or interview, lots have moved back to that in-person approach, away from obviously the fully virtual approach that we saw for a number of years. So just a few stats there to give you an insight into some of the things that we'll be talking about when those reports are released. We will be doing webinars, but you can also register your interest to get a copy of the report when it is released in advance. I will pop that link into the chat. All you have to do is give us a few details and those will get sent out to you. So thanks for giving me 5 minutes. Hopefully some of you will join us at those sessions. Have a good rest of the afternoon, and I will hand back to Georgia, who's going to manage the questions.
Thanks, Emily. So, Martin, we've got a few questions. We've got some in the chat and some on the Q&A. So I'm going to start with the Q&A and then I'm going to come back to the chat. So Hannah has posed the question, does the point on same-day decisions being communicated apply equally to successful and unsuccessful outcomes?
That's a really good question. It didn't.
I thought that too.
Yeah, it didn't break it down for what I could see. Again, the interesting thing about this is it's a meta-analysis. So that's the sort of thing where you'll then be able to go into the actual research written by the people. I'm sure they would have covered that because that is a good question. I assume where you're coming from that is actually if it's good news, it's likely to be a positive thing, and almost the quicker you know, the better. But just thinking on that, there's a possibility that actually, if you're told on the same day, it might feel like there's almost a sense of desperation hasn't been considered that deeply. So I would say my guidance has been, it has prompted me, maybe I need to go back to the research to look at it. It has prompted me to look at that again, but the current thinking and my guidance is a day later at the earliest.
Thanks, Martin. And so other questions we've got here, one from Dean, coming back to the study about using ChatGPT. Were the ratings of integrity and honesty automated, i.e. was AI scoring AI's answers, or were they manual?
No, it was manual scoring, and all of the assessors were completely blind to what the study was doing. They didn't know it was related to that. So again, what it was showing is that the assessors were able to tell with quite a degree of certainty when people were using ChatGPT, especially when it was completely verbatim. It was almost, in every case they were able to spot it. Obviously, the risk is candidates are will become more and more sophisticated at using prompts to tweak it just enough. But even when that was happening in the study, they were still being identified. So in response to that, we have sort of really beefed up how we train any manual screeners to make sure they see a few different Gen AI responses to video interview questions, so they understand what sort of things might be coming up and use that to identify. And there's always an option to flag when there's something they're concerned about that could get a second review or anything like that.
Great, thank you. And then a question from Joanne. This is an interesting one about internal versus external candidates. How can we ensure a fair process when using the same assessment process for both internal and external candidates? Usually where the internal candidate will be far more familiar with the assessment processes used and how the company is going to be operating.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's something that we pay a lot of attention to at Amberjack, because one of our vision is to assess in a way that assesses for potential rather than past experience or privilege. And when I was talking about that point earlier around being really careful in the language used, that's one of the most common review points that I am looking at when I'm helping my team design and improve their assessment center activities, their online assessment content. Are you using words that is going to favor people who've had experiences in the workplace? Are you using acronyms? Is this really tailored to someone who has done it before? And what we have done with certain clients who really want to sort of increase their talent pool and attract new areas is we've done really detailed statistical analysis to check whether or not the exercises favor people who have worked in the organization previously versus those who haven't. So it's really hard to get right, because if you're creating a relevant exercise, if people have got really relevant experience, they're likely to be benefited. But in our review process, we just check we haven't done that too much and created an overly helpful process for people who've got certain experiences.
Super. Thank you, Martin. It's always a difficult one to make sure you're being fair to both types of candidates. So at the moment, we have covered all of the questions that have been submitted. If anybody does have any last minute questions or reflections they'd like to share with Martin, please do drop that in for us. Otherwise, I'll hand back, Martin, to you to do the close. And if a burning question comes up, I'll jump back on, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much. Let me just share the final slide that came on briefly. So I know some people are less comfortable raising questions in this sort of Q&A format. A couple of ways to get in touch with me on LinkedIn and via email. Again, my new corporate photo is up there. So before I take the plunge and make my LinkedIn profile picture, any feedback on that would be very much appreciated. And yes, thank you very much, Georgia, for facilitating the session. And thank you everyone for joining. And I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you so much, Martin, and lots of thanks coming through on the chat as well to you and Emily for the time today and Amberjack's research being shared there. Thank you everyone for making the time today. And as Martin said, if you do have any questions you'd like to reach out or find out more in terms of what Martin and the team are doing at Amberjack, please don't hesitate to get in contact. We'll be sharing this recording plus the slides with you all in the next few days, so please look out for that as well if you want to look back on anything you've heard or seen today. Martin, thank you so much. Emily as well, and thank you, audience. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks
Bye.
all.